Welcome back to Tales Arcane, where we talk about D&D, TTRPGs, and fantasy storytelling. Today we're going to throw away our battle maps and our minis and learn how to do better theatre of the mind during combat. I'm going to give you 5 tips that should help you as DM become more comfortable with this approach to combat and will lead your players to have a better, more immersive experience. Before we begin, as always, a quick shout out to my Patreons who make all of this possible. When you join the Tales Arcane Patreon, you get access to more than 1,000 pages of my original D&D homebrew content, including adventures, campaign settings, encounters, battle maps, and a whole lot more. There's a link to my Patreon down below this video. The term Theatre of the Mind simply means using your imagination instead of a battle map during combat. Most DMs, whether online or in person, will rely on some kind of battle map or terrain pieces when combat breaks out, but this has 2 main drawbacks. Drawback number 1, battle maps usually have to be created in advance, so if you're a GM who's very reliant on battle maps and combat breaks out unexpectedly, this can leave you feeling a little bit out of your depth, and it can even encourage some DMs to railroad players away from combat instead of allowing them to make the choices they would naturally make. The second drawback is that sometimes a battle map can almost detract from player immersion instead of increasing it. D&D is a game of the imagination, but when combat comes out, it becomes very rules heavy and technical, and if you have a battle map in front of the players, things start to feel more like a regular board game. Players start to feel almost like spectators rather than participants. They roll their dice, they say what their little piece on the map will do, and then they sit back without feeling personally invested in the situation. So here are my 5 tips for creating better theatre of the mind experiences. When the fight breaks out, quickly describe 3 or 4 key orienting landmarks on the map. These are objects or structures on the map that players can use to get a sense of the space. They can talk about how close they are to those objects, whether they're moving in the direction of those objects. It will help players visualize the scene and their own character's place in that scene, and it will help players communicate to each other and to you what their intentions are and what their movements are. For example, let's say a fight breaks out unexpectedly in a tavern, and we're going to use theatre of the mind for the battle. The players know they're in a tavern, they can imagine the tables and chairs, all the random details throughout the space, but you're going to mention to them specifically that against the western wall is the bar, against the northern wall is the fireplace, and that there is a main doorway in the southern wall. And now these are going to be the 3 key orienting landmarks for the rest of the fight. Now a player can say, okay, I want to take cover behind a table near the fireplace. They go over to that area and they get down behind that table. You don't need to decide which specific table in the space they're getting behind, you just know it's one of the tables near the fireplace. The fireplace is the orienting landmark. This approach is going to help players anchor themselves physically in the space, give them a strong sense of where their characters are, their relative positions to each other and to the environment around them. But most importantly, it's going to help you as the GM. Things can get very hard to keep track of during combat, and having a couple of big anchoring landmarks to orient yourself around will help you keep track of where everyone is and where everyone will have to go to move around the space. Don't worry too much about distances and exact movement speeds. In D&D, every creature has a movement speed. For most of the players, it will be round about 30 feet, and distance is important because it determines things like area of effect efficiency, things like the range with which you can attack people, but in Theatre of the Mind, we don't want to get too bogged down with these kind of details. When it comes to Theatre of the Mind, I find it really useful to focus on how many turns it takes to move around the map, rather than the exact distances in feet. For example, if the players are moving from they're moving across the tavern, they're going from the fireplace to the door, I might think, well, that's roughly 60 feet, but what's more important is it takes about 2 turns if they're doing just their normal movement, or if they're taking the dash action, it will take 1 turn. Sure, the dwarf is going to move a little bit slower with their 25 feet, the wood elf is moving a little faster with their 35 feet, but outside of very specific cases, some of which we'll come to later, I wouldn't get too pressed about being specific about these things. Think about it in groups of roughly 30 feet, roughly 1 turn of movement, and think about your landmarks and how many turns of movement they are apart from each other. Of course, taking this looser approach means that careful strategizing based on distance kind of goes out the window. But that is just one of the many things that goes out the window when you're losing the benefits of the battle map and gaining the benefits of Theatre of the Mind. Things are slapdash, intense, quite fast moving, and that is often going to be the case with these smaller, unexpected combat encounters, and you don't necessarily get much benefit from worrying too much about complex strategizing based on being 35 feet away versus 30 feet away. Now, sooner or later, someone's going to cast an AoE spell, an area of effect spell, and you're going to have to work out how that interfaces with this looser distance environment. So let's say the wizard sees two bandits burst in that front door of the tavern to reinforce their friends who are already fighting inside, and the wizard casts a fireball. That's a 20-foot radius. Now, normally if you're on a map, you might measure that out in the space, but we're just going to say, well, those two bandits burst into the room together. They're both by the door, so they can both comfortably be caught in that 20-foot radius. No need to measure anything. But hold on, the fighter who was at the fireplace spent his last turn running across the room towards the doorway. He was hoping to bar it before those bandits got in, but he didn't make it in time. But that means he's been running in the direction of what is now a fireball. So does he get caught in it? Well, we know that it takes about 2 turns to get from the fireplace to the door. He spent 1 turn doing it, so he's probably about 30 feet away from the door. He's probably not going to get hit in that 20-foot blast radius. Now, things aren't always as precise as that. Maybe the bandits got into the room and moved a little bit forward. You describe them running into the room and then stopping to fire off some arrows, so they're probably not standing right next to the door. And maybe that fighter is a wood elf who used their full 35 feet of movement running towards the door. So logically, within the things that have been said so far and imagined so far in this Theatre of the Mind experience, logically, maybe that fighter is within the blast radius of that 20-foot fireball. So it kind of comes down to the circumstances and what feels fair and rational under the circumstances. If the wizard specifically says, oh no, I'm going to put my fireball a little bit behind those bandits so it captures them, but there's no overlap into the surrounding area, then you can work something out. But I would just say, try to treat it on a case-by-case basis, be as logical as you can, but also, if a ruling isn't perfect, it doesn't matter. You can discuss it afterwards, you can learn from it, you can move on. Without a map, there's no visual stimulus to wow the players and to get them immersed in the scene. And so that's why it helps as DM to keep some description flowing throughout the battle. You might not be as description heavy as you would in a roleplay scenario, or if they were walking through some kind of stealthy environmental section, but it's still worth having what I call descriptive keystones to come back to give the whole scene a bit more flavour. The players probably have a rough sense of the environment they're in. You describe the tavern to them when they first entered it, and maybe at the start of the fight you remind them of how the tavern looks, roughly where things are, where those landmarks are, and mention that there's some tables throughout the space that could be used for cover. But then you're going to focus in on one keystone descriptive element. So for example, we might take the fire. That's going to be the centerpiece of our descriptions, the crackling fire in the northern wall. Now, whenever you have a chance, you're going to use that fire as the core of your descriptions for the battle. Maybe someone draws their sword and flames are seen reflecting, glimmering along the steel. Maybe one of the bandits rushes towards the players, and as he goes in front of the fire, his body is a black silhouette storming across the room. Maybe one of the players gets up close to an enemy and can see the flames reflected in that enemy's eyes. Perhaps a player and an enemy are grappling and their shadows seem to merge and dance across the wall, reflected by the fire. The players know they're in a tavern and they know roughly what a generic medieval tavern looks like. You don't have to keep reminding them that there are dark wooden beams overhead or glistening bottles behind the bar. But by focusing on the descriptive keystone of the fire, you can give them this strong visual sense, the lurid colours of the flames, the flickering shadows, the sense of light and dark playing across the environment quite chaotically. And in the moment, and also when they look back on it, there's going to be this strong visual impression of this fight based purely off a single element of description. Alternatively, let's imagine that a fight has broken out with some thugs in an alleyway in a coastal port town. The players are going to have this quick, intense brawl in this alleyway, and we're going to focus on the gulls that are wheeling overhead and make them our descriptive keystone for the battle. So initially, perhaps the gulls fly up into the air from where they've been roosting when swords begin to clash against each each other, the sense that what was calm has now been broken by the intensity of the action. Throughout the battle, the war cries of the people who are fighting on the ground are echoed by the screeches of the birds overhead, jarring calls echoing with the clash of steel. And players are going to be thinking about the sound of seagulls that they've heard in real life, and they, unbidden, will start to think of things associated with that. The smell of the ocean, the smell of the fish market down the road, the cold sea wind in their face as they sweat and fight their way up this narrow alleyway. You're only using one descriptive keystone, it's the seagulls overhead, but you're calling to mind all these other elements at the same time. It's not about overdoing descriptions and shoving them in the players' faces while the battle is going, while they're trying to focus. It's just about lightly peppering in that one key descriptive element throughout the battle to make sure the players still feel transported and immersed in this fantastical setting, even though they don't have a visual guide in front of them. I would recommend just at the start of the battle writing down what your descriptive keystone is going to be on a little sticky note or something, and just slap it down on the maybe next to the initiative order if you've written that down, so you can keep on seeing it and reminding yourself, oh yeah, any way I can bring this in, I will bring this in. As the battle progresses, take moments here and there to kind of recap where everyone is and what the state of play is on the battlefield. You don't have to do this all the time, but for example, at the start of every round, you might take a quick moment to tell the players roughly where the enemies are on the map right now, what the current state of the environment is, if perhaps things are being destroyed or moved around throughout the course of the battle. Or you can encourage players every now and then at the start of their turn to just say roughly where they are and what they see around them as they look around the space. Keep encouraging people to verbalize where they are and what they're doing and what their intentions are, because it's easy to underestimate just how quickly players will start to forget key information. A player can make their whole strategy for several turns about getting from one area to another, only to realize that they mixed something up and the thing they were trying to get to is not in that area. And a good way to avoid that is to just keep verbalizing what's around them and keep encouraging the players to recap what they're doing. It's also good to encourage players to ask about this stuff. You don't want players to be sitting there not really sure where they are, where their enemies are, but not feeling confident enough to come out and say so. So in addition to your own recaps and regularly bringing up the idea that we need to reorientate ourselves around the map, you can just every now and then say to people, does everyone know where everything is? Does everyone feel that they have a good sense of the map? Especially at the start of a new round, you can jump back in and say, by the way, before we go further, does anyone need a quick recap on maybe where all the enemies are, especially if there's a lot of minions in play? Don't worry about repeating yourself. It's always better in this scenario to be more repetitive than less repetitive and leave your players in the lurch, especially if they're new to Theatre of the Mind. The final tip for using Theatre of the Mind instead of a map is sometimes, but just don't put it in front of your players. When you're starting out with Theatre of the Mind, if you've maybe not done this before, when combat begins, quickly sketch out what the environment looks like for yourself on a bit of scrap paper behind your DM screen. It doesn't have to be beautiful or exactly the right proportions, because again, the players aren't going to see it, but this is going to really help when you're trying to keep track of everything and when you're trying to give helpful descriptions about where certain landmarks are on the map. The last thing you want as DM is to start losing your own sense of direction, losing the sense of how far apart objects are, or where in terms of the compass points key landmarks are. If you don't know that stuff, I guarantee you your players don't know that stuff. So the more you can be on top of that, the more helpful you will be as a resource to keep your players on track throughout this imaginative experience. Finally, just as a more general point, you don't need to commit to just one or the other, Theatre of the Mind or battle maps. Personally, I like to do big, elaborate battle maps for my boss battles, the sort of major set-piece battles that I can easily anticipate a mile off. But when it comes to day-to-day stuff, being able to confidently do Theatre of the Mind is such a lifesaver, because it means that you can have combat break out anywhere without stressing about being prepared enough. As long as you have a rough sense of where the players are in the world, as long as you're giving them good descriptions of their environments, you're always going to be ready to jump in, hopefully using these tips to launch your Theatre of the Mind experience, and then further up the road you probably will whip out a big beautiful battle map when that major boss battle occurs at the end of a campaign arc. Anyway, that is the video. I hope you've enjoyed it, I hope you found it useful, and I hope it's inspired you to at least try moving away from dependency on battle maps and implementing more theatre of the mind. Theatre of the mind can be so powerful and effective, it can liberate you as a DM to deal with more unexpected situations, and it just makes you a better improv DM. Ultimately, improvisation is what Dungeons & Dragons is all about. Thank you for watching, thank you for backing me on Patreon if you're a Patreon supporter, and I'll see you in the next video.